Ready to learn the secret to cooking from scratch? Hi, I'm Rachel from Rachel's Real Food Kitchen, and today we're going to talk about how understanding this one simple principle of cooking will transform your life in the kitchen. So, is cooking an art? Is cooking a science? That's a debate for another day. But I think it is safe to say that there is a chemistry involved in food. And understanding that chemistry can actually be the key to simply following a recipe or simply learning how to cook. So today we're going to go through some examples very quickly here to teach you how to go beyond the what ingredients, and into the how are they combined? Because understanding those two differences is essential to understanding how to combine ingredients later, to get beyond a recipe and into just cooking mode. So taco meat, for instance, what does taco meat and chemistry have to do with anything? Well, fun fact, if you combine spices, particularly those that are found in taco meat, like those related to peppers, hot peppers of various kinds, and chili peppers and things like that, if you combine those things in hot oil, you will actually end up with a richer, deeper, more developed flavor in the meat. Now, this is a principle of cooking things in fat that actually also carries over to flour for gravy as well, or things like that. There's a basic principle where you cook that flour in a fat, like a butter, or maybe it's the drippings from the meat that you cooked, and that's how you get the base to make a gravy or a roux in some fancier cases. Apple pie is another really good example of this as well, because with pastry generally, when you're working with it, you're keeping it cold, you're not mixing it much, and has a very high fat content compared to other kinds of breads, right? So if you understand how gluten develops, for instance, you'll understand that you treat pastry or biscuits different than what you're going to treat, say, a yeast dough or even a sandwich bread or a pizza crust or something along those lines. Bagels are another example of this, because if you understand what things you do to the dough and how that will influence the texture and the flavor, you'll also be able to start to understand why certain cooking methods are so important. In the case of bagels, if you're making them at home, to make that distinctive bagel chewy texture, you know how you get that? You boil the bagel before you bake it in a very hot oven. So that's very, very different than how you're going to cook, say, that apple pie that we just talked about earlier, or if you're going to do like a sandwich bread or something like that. Those certain processes, those little tweaks, are the difference between one recipe and another. Same with sourdough. You can make a sandwich bread that you beat and beat and beat. That's going to be very different than the bagel because you boiled the bagels. Cake is very different as well. Now, one of the reasons that cake can be so different is the addition of eggs, right? And generally, when you deal with cake, especially like angel food or jelly roll or something of that nature, you're going to end up slitting the eggs in the yolks and the whites, which means that you're going to generally beat those egg whites or beat those egg yolks until a certain texture forms. Once you understand how to do that, once you understand how to maintain their integrity of the structure after you've beaten them and how you incorporate them into the dough, translates into other things as well. It could translate into meringue, it could translate into other baked goods, other cakes, cookies, desserts, all sorts of things rely on that same chemical process. Spaghetti sauce is also a unique example of this as well, because one of the things about tomatoes is that they are pretty acidic, right? Some are more than others, some are sweeter than others, but generally, like when you're making spaghetti sauce, you don't necessarily want that deep bite, that sharp tang to it. You want some of that, but you don't necessarily want all of it. So that's why you add some sweetener to offset that acidity just a little bit. The acidity in tomatoes can also cause things to tenderize or toughen them up depending on what they are. I believe it's lentils. One time I tried to cook lentils in like a tomato sauce for it was like a sloppy lentils type recipe, kind of like sloppy joe with lentils. They were undercooked, and I thought, oh, the tomato will soften them up. Not for legumes. It may do that for, say, meat, for like barbecue meat or something like that. It will not do it with lentils. Take it from something I learned from a lesson. Now, homemade candy is another one, and granted, I know that marshmallows or whatever they may not be super healthy, but you do understand that when you've set over a boiling pot of sugar, you learn a thing or two about the chemical processes that are involved. Candy making is not necessarily easy, particularly if you have like a bad candy thermometer or you're at a weird elevation or something like that. But the principles that you use for candy making are simply the same across the board, which means that the same principles that you use for making marshmallows are the same that you make taffy, make hard candy. You understand that if you cook that sugar long enough, it will get harder and harder and harder, stretching from the thin, stretchy, chewy candy all the way to the hard, brittle stuff. Now, pickles are another one too, and this picture is of fermented pickles, which is basically lacto-fermentation. It's a saltwater brine. And once you understand how that salt water works in a recipe like this one, you understand that it preserves, that it prevents mold. You understand you need to keep things submerged under that liquid to keep them fermenting properly, to keep them from spoiling. Then you'll understand to be able to transfer that knowledge to other fermented foods as well. Now, for the case of pot roast, for instance, that also means understanding, remember what we talked about the herbs and the flavors that develop when you brown things in oil, particularly when there's fat. Well, with pot roast too, you understand that, oh, this fat is going to be what gives flavor, it gives tenderness to the meat. And so one of the principles when you're cooking a pot roast is to cook it with the fat cap on top so the drippings will drip down into the meat and make it more tender. See, that's what I was talking about as the secret, because you need to learn how to use the ingredients and the processes first. Now, how do you do that? Well, let me tell you a little story. So recently, one of the family members in my family decided to try the keto diet. Now, I'm not familiar with the keto diet at all. I've never baked with coconut flour or anything like that before this happened. And I realized I was going to need to learn how to do some of that. And it was fine. It was fun, but I never cooked with these things before. I'm definitely a gluten baker. I am not a gluten-free baker by any means. So it was very different. The first time that we even experienced coconut flour was very different, right? It's kind of gritty. It gets thicker as it sets. Sometimes you have to set it in things. And let me tell you, the first time that I used it, I was not at the point where I was comfortable just throwing it in a pan and making something, right? I didn't know how to combine it. I didn't know quite how it would react because I never used it before. So the first thing that I did was go search out recipes from other people who were way more experienced about using coconut flour and almond flour and some of these other more unusual ingredients, and tried their recipes out first to become a little more comfortable with coconut flour and baking with it and things like that. Now, I am not going to turn around and make a recipe tomorrow because I still don't have that much of a grasp on how it works and how you need to use it in every application. I just don't have enough experience with that yet. But over time, I have, even just in the last couple of weeks, have started to learn how to use it, have by trial and error understood what the texture should be, what it shouldn't be, what it normally, how it reacts, what it looks like with different ingredients and things like that. That's how you learn how to cook from scratch. You learn by doing. It's an experience thing. It's touching, it's feeling, it's seeing, it's smelling it. From beginning to end, to learn how to use those ingredients and those processes from start to finish. So I want to hear from you. What do you want to learn how to cook first? Comment below. And let me tell you, when you start experimenting with this, some things will work, some things will don't, but every recipe that you try, everything that you try to make from scratch will teach you something about the ingredients, something about the process. And before long, when you get to that point, when you get to the point where you understand how the ingredients combine with one another, how the chemical processes to react in cooking or baking or boiling or frying or sauteing or all these different things, when you understand those components of cooking, then you get to the point where you can make a recipe simply with the ingredients that are in front of you. It's not that you won't ever use a recipe. Most people still use recipes. There are a few things that you're probably always going to need a recipe for. Pastry might be one of them, for instance, some of those fancier desserts in particular. But for everyday things, once you learn how to cook those basic ingredients and you learn how to handle those basic processes, you'll understand that cooking is really just a science. It's a combination of things and factors that, when combined properly, will lead you with a delicious product. That's the secret of cooking from scratch.